following even going into the presidential campaign was because he was a virtual reality TV star. This is very much the kind of thing that Plato wanted to prevent, right? Because in that respect, Trump is very much, he's maybe not a playwright, but he's an actor. He's a good actor, right?
And tilting at the philosopher kings as well, right? Saying, these people are constructing a reality which benefits them, not you, my voters.
Well, exactly. And, so for example, if you look at the way in which Trump was attacking Hillary Clinton and the Washington establishment generally, what he was talking about, the need to drain the swamp, as he called it, right, during the campaign. I mean, it was all about, as it were, revealing the backstage, as it were, of what keeps the establishment going, as if they too, Hillary Clinton and the Washington establishment were also, in a sense, playwrights and actors, fabricating a certain kind of reality. And so the fact that Trump is coming on the scene, right, is that he's contesting that, and part of the way he's able to do that is by bringing them down, you might say, to his level, right? So say, look, these are not exalted people. These are people who also just operate on the basis of props and persuasion and so forth. And you see, when you get to that kind of stage level of argument, where basically what you're contesting is not really the truth claims as such, but rather the conditions for the possibility of making truth claims, then you're in the post-truth condition.
Well, so far, so philosophical. Where this notion of post-truth becomes a little more contentious is in the world of science. And at this point, we need to take a brief 20th century detour via two important figures, the Italian social economist Vilfredo Pareto and the philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn. Now, Pareto was writing in the 1920s, and he believed that societies are formed by the interplay between two groups, which he called lions and foxes. These are terms that he lifted from Machiavelli. The lions are the guardians of the status quo. They're the establishment, and they correspond roughly to Plato's philosopher kings. The foxes, on the other hand, are the Donald Trumps, the disruptors, the revolutionaries, the ones who hold out a vision of a social order quite different to the established order overseen and defended by the lions. Thomas Kuhn, who was exposed to Pareto's ideas as an undergraduate in the 1940s, saw this same dynamic between traditionalists and revolutionaries, between lions and foxes, as the driving force behind the way that modern science is practiced.
If you look at Kuhn's view about how scientific change works, most of what science is about, according to Kuhn, is about what the lions are doing, right? So in other words, what Kuhn calls normal science, that is to say the ordinary everyday science, most of the scientific papers that are published, which are done according to very prescribed theories, methodologies, which scientists are taught about at university and is reproduced over and over and over again, that's in fact the bulk of science. It's not maybe the aspects of science that get written about in popular literature, where we think about people like Galileo, for example, or Darwin, these kind of trailblazers who break with the establishment. But in fact, most science is this kind of normal, everyday science, which is the lion science, as it were. And in fact, the thing that's very interesting about the scientific community, according to Kuhn, which makes it different from other kinds of intellectual and cultural formations, is the degree of unanimity on one paradigm in a science at any given time. And this is really quite striking. And unlike, let's say, dominant political authorities, this is done in a kind of self-organizing fashion, right? So it's not like there's a, scientist dictator who kind of lays down the law for all the other scientists, but rather it's through this kind of self-organizing collective peer review process that you end up getting a kind of establishment that's formed. And it's a self-enforcing establishment. And so it actually makes it very difficult for people who have different ideas, including ideas that in the past may have been considered relevant to the scientific inquiry, but had been excluded as a result of the peer review process. It's very difficult for them to actually get entry. So the only time these foxes, you might call them, these are the people with the outside ideas, the only time they actually have a chance is when the paradigm actually begins to run into problems of its own definition. Okay? So in other words, the paradigm is not able to live up to its own hype. It's not able to complete its own project. And so these are the things that Kuhn calls anomalies. So experimental outcomes that you cannot explain, right? Facts you did not expect to happen. And it's at that point, when you reach a certain critical mass of these things, that then the scientific community, for a brief period of time, opens itself up to the foxes. It has a crisis, as it were, and then the scientific revolution happens. But then it goes back to a normal lion-like state. You know, if you look at Kuhn's theory of science, the radicalness of science is just very temporary, and it's really just a way of flipping the cycle around to get to the next phase of lions. And this is kind of the way Pareto, if Pareto had done a theory of science that was like his theory of politics, then that's exactly what it would look like.
Doesn't this, though, paint the scientific establishment as too conservative? This is the issue I have here. My understanding of scientific method is that it's a process of constantly questioning assumptions and contesting established theories until they're ironclad. And isn't that what the lions are doing? I mean, do you have to be a fox to do that?
Well, the problem is that the lions are, again, this goes back to the point I was making earlier on about the control over the possibilities, right? So in other words, the range of possible hypotheses that are tested within a scientific paradigm are quite limited, okay? So there are alternatives being tested, but they're usually within the framework of a general theory that everybody in the field accepts. So if you want to test a hypothesis that doesn't presuppose that general theory in the paradigm, then you're not actually allowed any kind of entry point. So for example, some of the people listening here may know I was involved and still involved in the intelligent design controversy. And this has a lot to do with providing a kind of fundamental alternative starting point from the way in which we understand biology, especially as a result of the Darwinian revolution in biology. Whatever your biology is, you have to start with the assumption that however life about, it's going to be through processes of genetic variation and natural selection, and that there won't be any room for any kind of larger second-order form of intelligence guiding the process. Now, if you start to introduce intelligence, then you're no longer doing science. You may be doing religion, but you're not doing science. Now, you see, that's an example of where there's actually, at the outset, an exclusion of possibilities. Of course, this leaves an enormous number of possibilities that still can be tested within the scientific framework. So in that sense, you're right? There is always room for testing stuff, but the range is limited.
So when you're defending then intelligent design, which you've done in court as part of a court case in the US in the 90s, you're not then a proponent or a believer in intelligent design as such. You're more defending the principle that marginal or disruptive forms of knowledge should be allowed to take their place within the epistemic canon. Is that what's going on there?
Yes, I think that's generally speaking true. And this is why I have been, in my philosophy of science, I've been generally speaking a supporter of Karl Popper, because I do believe the distinctive feature about science is this kind of interesting combination of putting forward bold conjectures, as Popper put it, and then strong refutations, right? So you have this dynamic going on. So you have to, at the outset, open yourself to a very broad range of possibilities, but then subject them to very difficult tests. And that's what science is about. And that could be applied to any set of beliefs we're talking about here, okay? It doesn't just have to be beliefs that conform to certain kind of institutional requirements because we want to promote a certain kind of theory, but rather any kind of beliefs can be subjected to this. You can treat anything as scientific in this kind of Popperian sense. And so that's kind of what I was defending. So you're right about that. But there was also another kind of issue that's interesting, and this goes to kind of, again, foxes operate. One of the strategies that the foxes use against the lions is not only that we should have a more open environment. It's not just a kind of endorsement of openness as an intrinsically good thing, but rather you can actually identify specific possibilities that have been deliberately excluded, right? So in other words, there are some possibilities that may have been floated in the past, may have been used in the past as a basis for doing good science, that the establishment actually excludes now because it doesn't fit with the dominant theory. And see, intelligent design was in fact very much part of the frame of thinking that actually gave us modern science in the 17th century, and was in fact very much, part of the way in which scientific inquiry was conducted pretty much until the middle of the 19th century when Darwin's Origin of Species started to really change things substantially. So in promoting intelligent design, one isn't just simply promoting this idea because, one wants to consider every possibility regardless of whether it's ever borne fruit, but rather this is actually a possibility that in the past did bear fruit, but for institutional reasons has now been excluded. And that's the kind of thing that foxes will play against the lions, namely that the possibilities being excluded are being excluded not merely, or maybe not even primarily, on intellectual grounds, but rather something closer to political grounds because of the need to have consensus in order for science to present a kind of united front as a form of authority in society.
But aren't you making an argument then for the kind of openness to ideas and scientific concepts that may have been coded into scientific practice at some point in the past, but were excluded for what may be institutional reasons, but also there might be very sound institutional reasons. I mean, why wouldn't we then invite, say, right-wing racial theorists into university departments? Sometimes the disruptors are dangerous not because they challenge institutional vested interests, but because they're dangerous.
Well, you see, it's interesting you bring up that example. My view about the whole racial thing is that it ought to be actually more out there. I think a lot of these racial views, in a way, continue to have oxygen precisely because they're just out there, right? So in other words, because the scientific community refuses to engage very directly with these racists, the racists are able to say in a very fox-like fashion that they're being excluded because they know something that these lions don't want the people to find out about. Whereas I would say just bring modern genetics to bear on what a lot of these racists are saying, and I think you could just dissipate the whole racist issue very quickly, frankly.
With intelligent design, you've said that the principal aim of intelligent design is to change the ground rules of science to include the supernatural.
Yes.
And, of course, that's the grounds of resistance to intelligent design as well. Is changing the ground rules of science to include the supernatural a paradigm shift that you would actually like to see?
Well, look, here's my view. When people hear the word supernatural, they read lots of different things into it. But let's say we take a relatively benign view of supernatural, where we're talking about a form of knowledge that goes beyond just what we would normally have of the natural world through empirical inquiry, right? So in other words, having a kind of second-order understanding of, as it were, the reason, the meaning, whatever, of why it is the universe hangs together the way it does. If that's what what one means about the supernatural, then yes. So my answer to your question would be yes. See, my own personal view, and again, this is, I'm not speaking for anyone else other than myself here. I would say that in a sense, a lot of theology, in a way, provides kind of the framework that then really gets carried out in modern science. I think there's a real continuity there. So in other words, there's no real natural opposition. In fact, if you look at from a historical standpoint, I think there's no contestation over this matter. So what I've just told you, I think as a historical point is correct. Namely that if you want to look at where our notions of, gravity and causation and space and time and all these very fundamental notions even the notions of life and so forth, you will find that there's a theological origin to these things, which over time become, operationalized, secularized, naturalized, and then become kind of part of the normal scientific project. And then people, in a way, don't need to remember the theology. They can just drop that and just pursue science for its own sake. But when you get to a point down the line when people are asking questions, why are we doing this science? Especially, as you know, science has had checkered consequences, checkered results as it's become a much more powerful force in our society, right? And, so for example, the fact that we live in what geologists now call the Anthropocene, where the human species has left the largest footprint on the planet, is the primary causal agent of the various changes that are happening on Earth, and whether we're talking about the weather, climate, whatever. I believe that's true. Now, people have questions about this. Why are we doing this? Why do we have this much impact? We're just one among many species. Well, it seems to me this is where the theology matters, because actually the theology says we're a privileged species. We know what we're doing fundamentally at the end of the day. However fallible we may be, we're kind of moving, generally speaking, in the right direction, realizing